Yeah. Well, thanks so much for talking to me. I'm Josh Sharp from the DisInsider, head writer for the DisInsider. And I'm so excited to talk about your new book on Claude Coats. I just finished it a couple of days ago. So much incredible information there.
Great. I'm
Um,
glad. I hope you liked it.
I did. I really loved it. I loved that it touched on both his personal life,
Uh-huh.
kind of behind the scenes at home, but also, of course, his professional work as
Sure.
well. Before we dive in, I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about your background with the Walt Disney Company.
Sure, absolutely. I actually worked for for Walt Disney Animation Studios for just over 32 years, and I started sort of right before the Renaissance of Disney Animation began, and sort of exited at the tail end of that, and had a wild ride in between. I actually got to meet Claude Coats early in my career, and I mentioned that in my acknowledgments in the book.
Hmm.
And like so many of my books, it's like a serendipitous kind of situation as to how those books came about. With the Claude Coats book, it was really I happened to see Alan Coates, and I didn't know him. I wanted to talk with him and just let him know I had met his father and what a
Hmm.
really nice guy his father was. And that was it. And at the end of that conversation, Alan asked if I'd be interested in writing the book on his father. So, and of course I said yes.
Right.
It was funny because I was at a conference about 5 years ago, and I was walking into the conference, and Alan was walking out. I didn't know him, but
Hmm.
he saw my name badge and he said, "Hey, Dave Bossert, I just got your Dolly and Disney book at Barnes and
Oh, how
Noble." And
about
I,
that?
I was like, "Wow, my book is at Barnes and Noble! Holy mackerel!" You know, and and so I caught his name badge. It said Alan Coates, and I thought, well, he's got to be, Claude Coates' son.
Hmm.
And I went looking for him at the break that morning, and he had gone home not feeling well. And
Mm.
so a mutual friend of ours wound up putting us together via email, and then we met up for a lunch. And at the end of that lunch, Alan was like, "Would you be interested in doing it?" And it was kind of surprising that there was no book on Claude at that point. But I think you gather from reading this book that he was more about being a team member.
Hmm.
He wasn't as um, uh, outspoken or outgoing as some of the other early Imagineers, and he was a little more of an introvert. And I think that probably ties into why there hasn't been a book about him. And when you read this book, you find out the amazing accomplishments by this guy.
Yeah.
And I was in awe of him when I first met him because of the background work he did in the early Disney animated films. I mean, when you
Hmm.
look at the Wishing Well
Pinocchio and stuff.
sequence, yeah, the Wishing Well sequence in Snow White, the
Sure.
Geppetto's workshop in Pinocchio, and then even before those films, look at what he did on The Old Mill.
Hmm.
And I mean, the guy was just an incredible talent, so that's why it was an honor to be able to tell his story.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about it is, of course, in between all the text, there's all these, beautifully replicated drawings and illustrations and that he did, and some of those backgrounds that you mentioned as well. It
Yeah.
seemed like he was able to so effortlessly move between art styles, which was one of the things that really caught my eye as I was looking through it, because they weren't all stylized necessarily the same. There was so many different variations on the way that he drew.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we wanted to put a gallery of his artwork, of his personal artwork, at the back of the book
Hmm.
was that we wanted people to be able to see this arc of his painting style from the 1930s to the
Hmm.
1980s. And you got this sort of half a century, and you can literally, flipping the pages, see his painting style evolve and change.
Hmm.
And it's really, it's a treat to be able to see all of that in one place.
Well, it was a treat to, yeah, it was definitely for me as a reader to see all that. Because I must admit, you mentioned, there wasn't a book written and that surprised you. And I was one of those people that wasn't as familiar with his work.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, yeah, and I was going to ask if you think that kind of contributed to, um, or sorry, his humble personality contributed to the fact that there wasn't a lot written about him, and there wasn't a lot that, maybe he had sort of fallen in the cracks a little bit from,
Yeah,
Disney historians.
yeah, I definitely think that that's the case. I mean, that happens throughout history with people who are more introverted or just want to be more in the background. You know less about them, and that was the case with Claude. I mean, he had an incredible relationship with Walt Disney. He's one of the original Imagineers that Walt plucked from the animation department to help with Disneyland. He had the background in architecture and fine art to be able to do this kind of themed entertainment work. And Walt, Walt Disney wasn't a great artist. He was a great storyteller, but he was also, I think, an even better casting director. He was able to see something in people and know that even though they hadn't done it before, that they'd be able to do it. And there's a great story about rainbow caverns in the book as part of Nature's Wonderland, the mine train
Oh
through
yeah.
Nature's Wonderland. And we've all heard these great quotes from Walt over the years, taken out of context, but to find out how one of his most famous quotes, isn't it fun to do the impossible? Right? It's kind of fun to do the impossible, whatever. I'm
Right.
paraphrasing it, but everybody knows what I'm talking about. But that quote came out of a conversation with Claude Coats. And Claude was trying to figure out how to keep this black light dyed water in the Rainbow Falls separated so that the colors didn't mix, because in the splashing at the bottom of the waterfall you would just get mud in a matter of minutes. It was those colors would all mix together and it would be this muddy grayish black color. And Hans Haber, the rocket scientist that had been consulting with Disney on some of the man in space programming in the 50s, along with Werner von Braun, Hans Haber said to Claude, "It's statistically impossible. You can't do that. The colors will mix and it'll be mud." And so Claude conveys that to Walt in a conversation. He says, Hans Haber said that this is impossible to do. And Walt looks at him and says, "Isn't it kind of fun to do the impossible?" And walks away, knowing that Claude's going to figure it out.
Right. Well, I'm
That,
sure Walt
and
had
he
heard
did.
that. Of course.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I love about the book, is that it really shows that they were just literally making up technologies and making up ideas as they were going. These weren't things that they were repackaging. They were coming up and presenting these things for the first time. They were the first ones doing it in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've personally gained from my career at the company was I have it ingrained in me that you don't say no, or you don't say I can't do that. It's ingrained in me to say, well, how can we do it? What could we do to figure that out? And I find that, especially today, I notice people are quick to say, no, I can't do that. Or no, we can't do it that way. And I always want to say, well, why can't we? What can we do to make it work that way? And so I think that's, there's huge lessons in there about not walking away and saying, oh, it's impossible. Oh, this rocket scientist with a PhD, he said, I can't do it. Oh, I guess I can't do it, but instead he did figure out how to do it.
Right.
And it was very simple. I mean, he used rubberized hog's hair battens to separate the water, and the rubberized hog's hair, which is kind of like a scrubby type of like Scotch pad scrubbing sponge.
Okay.
Or cleaning pad,
Sure.
that kind of material, roughly, that was used to essentially absorb the splashes to
Hmm.
prevent them from crossing over between the different colors.
Hmm.
And it was a simple solution, but it took time to figure it out and lots of trial and error. So,
Yeah.
when it is fun to do the impossible, and you have to have that mindset to say, well, yeah, okay, it hasn't been done before, but let's figure out how we could do it.
Hmm.
you know
And
so
I think that first response where you say people say, "Well, I can't do that," I think that really comes from just a fear of failure. And Walt had been told no a million times for various things that it wasn't possible or he couldn't do it. But of course, he was able to, like you say, figure it out. And he had that faith in his Imagineers and his
yeah,
animators too, which not just so he didn't just hold that standard for himself. He held it for everybody that was working for him.
exactly. And I think when you work in an environment like that long enough, that you get conditioned that way. I think most people growing up are conditioned to the word no. Their parents are saying, no, you can't do that, no, you can't go out, no, you can't have the car, you're gonna, it's like, you're constantly being hit with no's. I
Hmm.
remember once at the studio, I had somebody say to me, no, we can't do that. I said, how come? Well, that's because we've always done it this way. And I
Yep.
said, well, but
Tradition.
why are you doing it that way? Well, I don't
Hmm.
know. We just always have done it. They didn't even know why they were doing it. And then when you start to unravel that and have a conversation and say, well, could we, for this, make an exception and do it this way? And then
Hmm.
they go, well, I guess we could. I don't see why we couldn't do
Right.
that.
There's no official rule.
Yeah,
It's just
exactly.
all
So
made up. Yeah.
it was just something else. So and I think that's what's so brilliant about Walt in not being constrained by the naysayers and people who just say no. Is if again, another famous quote: "If you can dream it, you can do it," kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah.
It's like if
Another one
you
that's always taken out of context.
yeah, but if you can dream up something, then go figure out how to do it, for crying out loud.
Right.
And that's really what's been great. And for me, having been conditioned like that for more than 3 decades with the company, it's second nature.
Mhm.
And that's part of what drives me in picking projects that I want to work on now and books that I want to write,
Mhm.
is that I don't want to do things that have been done already. I
Mhm.
want to I want to tackle projects and stories that haven't been told. And
Sure.
certainly the Claude Coats story fit into that.
Absolutely. You mentioned you got to know him a little bit kind of near the end of his career and sort of at the start of your career. Um, but you kind of got to know him, I would assume, a lot better by talking to his son, Alan, and preparing to write this book and going through all of those family pictures and all that stuff. Was there anything that you found out about Claude or even about Disney as a company that surprised you?
Well, I think there were certain stories that popped out that were a little bit of surprise. I had no idea that he was shoveling coal on a steam freighter across the Pacific to Tokyo and then Shanghai in the 1930s.
Hmm.
He did that for I guess a couple of months in between school years. That was a bit of a surprise. And then there was as part of the California Society, I think it was the California Watercolor Society, or the California Society of Illustrators. It was one of those. I think it was the Society of Illustrators, which Claude was part of. The United States Air Force wanted to get some artists to paint some of their operations in different parts of the world. And so Claude went to Japan in 1961 and painted some of the U.S. Air Force base operations that were going on over in Japan. And that was something that I thought was really interesting, because it was sort of outside of what he was doing at the studio. But as an artist, all of those kinds of experiences contribute to how you act as an artist and things that you do as an artist. You may not, you may do a trip in 1961 to Japan, but that might not come back to you and flow through your work life until, maybe the 1980s, when he's working on
Sure.
Epcot and doing the Japan Pavilion.
Hmm.
It's that kind of a thing. And so we wanted to include those experiences, which was the Japan trip. A lot of people don't realize that, that he even did that.
Hmm.
I had the manuscript vetted by a number of people that knew him, like Tony
Hmm.
Baxter was
Sure.
mentored by Claude, and they didn't even know he had done this trip to Japan in 1961. And of course the 64-65 World's Fair, we
Hmm.
wanted to talk about that, because most of those attractions, or some portion of those attractions, eventually made it back to Disneyland.
Hmm.
And there was also the trip in 1965 to NASA,
Hmm.
to tour the space program, where they went to Rocket City in Huntsville, Alabama, and went to Houston, and from Houston went to Cape Canaveral. And again, all of those kinds of trips and experiences impact you as an artist, and add to your experience, and are things that you can draw off of in the future.
Hmm. And
So
initially it may be subconscious, right? I mean, it might,
yeah,
you'll store it
absolutely.
back there, and then, like you say, it might come out
Yeah,
20 years later in something, and you think, oh, I remember this so vividly. I would
absolutely,
imagine. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, that's, again, one of the reasons why at Disney Animation the filmmakers would go on these fabulous trips
Hmm.
to locations, like when they were working on Lion King, they
Sure.
did like a 3 or 4 week safari in Kenya, where they were out in the brush and seeing the animals in their natural habitat, and meeting people, and hearing various, the Hakuna Matata is a Swahili term,
Hmm.
and they would not have really probably learned that unless they had met people who spoke Swahili.
Sure.
So it's all of those kinds of experiences that add to the authenticity of whatever it is you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really came through in this book too was it felt very collaborative. You were collaborating with his son Alan, and you were also collaborating with, well, not collaborating maybe, but doing interviews with a lot of people like Marty Sklar
Mhm.
and Tony Baxter. Would you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, look, anytime I take on a project, you want to do as much research as you possibly can,
Sure.
and also, writing a book is a solitary type of endeavor. But at some point, you have to take your manuscript and hand it to a bunch of people and have them read it and vet it and
Hmm.
tell you, like, hey, this is good, or hey, this is a load of crap.
Hmm.
But you do need to have people to go out and vet what you've written and read it and give you notes and things like that. So it was invaluable to be able to have somebody like Tony Baxter read the book. He read the manuscript a couple of times, came back with, a couple of notes. It wasn't like a tremendous amount of notes, but there were a few things that he said, well, you might want to word this differently, or, give you a little bit more insight on something. Of course, Alan Coates was there all along the way. I mean, the
Hmm.
book couldn't have been done without Alan and the family and the family archive, of all of Claude's materials. But there were other people, there were other Imagineers who read the manuscript and, gave it their blessing, really, gave us nice jacket quotes and, got a few notes here and there from people. But that's what you want to do. And You want to be able to work in that kind of environment. As far as the interviews go, of course, you know, in before the writing even started, we went out and interviewed a whole bunch of people. Spent time interviewing Tony Baxter and Marty Sklar. I believe we did probably the last interview that Marty did in his life.
Well, I noticed you wrote that, and you mentioned that in your book, and I thought that that's something I remembered.
Yeah, and you know, I had known Marty for many years, and he was such an incredibly nice man. And I vividly, you know, remember reaching out to him and say, "Could we interview you about Claude?" He said, "Absolutely." He invited us, Alan and I, up to his home, and we recorded the interview in his office, in his home office. And I mean, what a tremendous individual he was. And such a nice man. And I'm just so fortunate that we were able to record an interview with him, which, you know, in hindsight turned out to be the last interview he did.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, but you know, it's a process, and you do want to talk to a lot of different people, as many different people as you possibly can, and get as much information. And there had been, you know, other interviews done with Claude throughout the years, and so we had access to transcripts and things like that. So it really allowed us to put together an overarching story.
Definitely. How is this different than some of the other books that you've written? I mean, I know you've written a lot of books about, you've written books about cartoons, like the Oswald book, for example, written books about other figures at Disney, like Roy E. Disney. How is this book different than those in terms of the process?
Well, I think this was a deeper dive on Claude, and it took a little bit longer. You know, the book I did on Roy Disney, I said right up front, it wasn't a biography on Roy. It really was a collection of stories that you know, I had experienced, and I got a few other stories from other people that I sprinkled throughout the book. And that really was, I wanted people, when they read Remembering Roy E. Disney, to walk away, like put the book down when they finished it and go, wow, he was an incredible, like a nice guy, like down to earth. I wanted people to get a sense of who Roy was, because I knew him reasonably well.
Not just facts, but how he was as a person.
And you know, a lot of people, you know, look at folks that are billionaires and, you know, the heads of, you know, corporations and things like that as maybe being out of touch or snobbish or this or that. And I wanted people to know that Roy wasn't that. You know, that like he shopped at Save on Drugs, and you know, he ate hot dogs at Costco, and you know, he was like this down to earth guy. And I thought it was important to put those stories into a book. So that was a different kind of book. If I had set out to do a biography, it would be a much deeper dive, and there'd be a lot more facts and dates and these things happened and that things, you know, those kinds of things. But that wasn't that kind of a book. You know, each of these book projects is its own animal, and it has its own challenges. And I love the challenge of doing projects or doing topics that haven't been done before. And, you know, I thought when we were doing when I started the Claude Coats book, the guy had a 54.5-year career at the Disney company. And he himself said he had two distinct careers. He had 20 years in the animation department, and then he had 34.5 years as an Imagineer. And he worked on everything from he worked on all the features from Snow White up to Lady and the Tramp. And then at Imagineering, he worked on everything from Disneyland to Epcot, Walt Disney World, Paris, and Tokyo. So, you know, you had to look at this career and say, well, what story do we want to tell? What portion of it? Because you can't tell. I mean, we could have 3 volumes on this guy. You can't tell the whole story in one book, because you wouldn't be able to do justice to all aspects of his career. So we decided to focus pretty much on that first 15 years of Disneyland, which is kind of considered the golden age of Disneyland. You know, it's when all those iconic attractions like Pirates and Haunted Mansion and the Sub Voyage and, you know, all of those kinds of attractions were put into the park. So that's what we decided to focus on.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things I found so interesting, was that he kind of jumped into Imagineering and left that animation career behind almost without knowing it. It was kind of just, Walt said, okay, you do this, and then it kind of happened. Did he ever, of course, it sounds like he had a great time doing his Imagineering work. Did he ever miss the animation portion of?
Yeah, I don't think he did. I think by the time he was doing Lady and the Tramp, he was kind of done with doing background and color styling on the animated pictures. He was wanting to do more things. He wanted to stretch his wings. So I think he was really pleased with the fact that Walt asked him to work on the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and he went from there. But there was a little bit of a transition that happened. You know, he was doing some different things that were happening during that time period. You know, he still painted a few backgrounds for a couple of shorts. You know, it was a bit of a looser kind of setup in the early, you know, when Walt was starting to build Disneyland, because there was no Imagineering really.
Sure.
You know, I mean, he set up this Walt, you know, WED Enterprises, but you know, these guys were just in offices in the animation building, and eventually kind of coalesced into, you know, one set of offices on the ground floor, you know, and there were some things being done on sound stages on the studio back lot, you know, and this is all before they moved to the you know, the Imagineering facility in Glendale. So, you know, I think you know, I think it was an easy transition for him, you know, because yes, he was working on these projects, but he was also, hey, Claude, you know, can you paint some backgrounds for this? And, you know, can you paint some maps for the chart room for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which he had done in the early 50s. And, you know, there was a little bit of a looser atmosphere of people walking in and say, hey, can you stop working on that for a week and do this, and you know, those kinds of things.
Right. And it kind of speaks to like what you were saying about Walt as a casting director. You know, he knew all the projects he was doing, and he'd say, okay, well, you would be good here, and you'd be good here, even if maybe they hadn't done that specific thing before, like Disneyland. But he knew that was going to be, it was going to work out.
Yeah.
He was going to make it happen.
And he also had these guys that he had been working with for years on animated pictures. And, you know, so, you know, there was a camaraderie, there was, you know, they knew each other, you know, they knew how he thought, and there was a sense of, you know, he could trust them to carry out his vision.
Definitely. Well, and I think that your book captures all of that so well, all the inner workings of that era. Of course, Claude specifically, but that's not the only project that you've been working on for the last year and, well, couple years. Now you've been doing your Skull Rock podcast, correct? And did you start that last year?
Yeah. So,
2020?
you know, it was really kind of, again, serendipitous how these things come about. And it's really kind of a nice story, because last summer I was making the rounds of the podcasters, the Disney podcasters, promoting my 3D Disneyland book that I did with Ted Kiersey.
That's a great book as well.
Thank you. And so I did a podcast with Al John Go, who hosts the Disney List podcast, and we just kind of clicked. I mean, we just had a really good conversation, and when the interview was over, you know, Al John sent me a note and said, hey, he goes, that was just so great. He goes, you ought to do a podcast yourself. And, you know, and I responded, because you know, over the years, I've had a number of people say to me, hey, you know, why don't you do a podcast, or why don't you do this or that, you know, where you're interviewing people. And you know, look, there's only so much time in the day that, from as far as I'm concerned. But I wrote back to Aljon and I said, hey, it was fantastic. You were terrific. I really felt like we clicked. We had an easy flow. If I ever did a podcast, I'd do it with you. I just kind of like said it as like
off the cuff.
It was
almost.
just a off the cuff comment,
Sure.
And he wrote back. He goes, "Are you serious? Because if you're serious, I would do a podcast." And I thought, well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I'm locked down in my office. I'm not going out to lunches and traveling like I usually do. And I said, sure. Yeah, I'll do a podcast. What do I need to do? And he sent me he goes, well, if you get this kind of a mic and this sort of a setup and this and that. And I said, okay, yeah, I can do that. And we started meeting via Zoom on Sunday mornings last August and September. So for a couple of months, really just to kind of chat and get to know each other and sort of spitball what we think the show would be and this and that. And then we just put a pin in the calendar and said, okay, let's do our first show in October. And I can't believe we're like a month away from our 1-year anniversary with Skull Rock Podcast. And it seems to have taken off because we're getting all kinds of great notes from people, and the reviews are stellar on Apple Podcast, and we got picked up by iHeartRadio. We're on Amazon Music, Audible, the Sorcerer Network, Spotify. I think the list goes on. Anchor FM. I mean, it just goes on and on. And so every week, we do a little bit about news that week that's going on, and then we have an interview, and we're not locked into any specific amount of time. We just let the interview flow. Some of them are 50 minutes, some of them are an hour and 40 minutes. I mean, we just kind of let the conversation flow. And if we're really getting some good material and people are chatty and telling great stories, why end it?
Sure. Well, yeah, you don't want to end it early and miss something,
exactly.
really valuable. Well, I have to say, I'm not surprised at all that it's taken off. I mean, it's a great podcast, and there are so many Disney podcasts out there, but I think you have special insight because you actually work for the Walt Disney Company, and you personally know a lot of these people you've interviewed just in this last year. And so, yeah, I hope people that haven't checked it out yet, maybe because they just get overwhelmed by the amount of Disney podcasts, I really hope that they will.
I mean, the thing with our podcast is that we're really delving into a lot of films that people love. Lion King and Hunchback and Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Nightmare Before Christmas, and all of these films we're talking about. And I actually happen to have worked on a lot of those films, so
exactly.
We're just booking a lot of people. And so I think what makes the Skull Rock Podcast kind of special is that you've got an insider and outsider. Aljon's an outsider, hasn't worked for the company, but he's a fan of the company. And you got me, who worked in the company for decades. I'm not there now, but I've worked there for decades, and I have this sort of insider perspective, and I think there's a nice counterbalance between the two of us in how we're interviewing our guests and the kind of questions that are being asked and things like that.
Yeah, because I would imagine those two different perspectives, an insider and an outsider, different questions are going to kind of brew in your guys' minds ahead of time. You might have totally different kinds of things you'd want to ask.
Absolutely. And so it's been kind of fun, and everybody I reach out to, nobody has said no yet, which has really been kind of neat.
That is really neat.
We're getting a lot of folks that just enjoy talking about that time period, and a lot of them, I think, we just did this week, we just posted the interview with Chris Montan, the former
Hmm.
president of Walt Disney Music, and he was really the guy that had his hand in overseeing all of those great musicals, you know, Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and Lion King and all those. And you know, he said to me I think it was either before or after we did our interview, he said, you know, he goes, I enjoyed talking with people like you because you were there, you know, and you know kind of the kind of
Hmm.
questions to ask, you know, and oftentimes you know, you know, wind up getting interviewed by somebody who really doesn't know the material, you
Hmm.
know, or they're asking you the same question you've heard like 50 times before, you
Sure.
know. So there's a nice there's an ease to the interviews, and there's a nice dynamic, and I'm able to prompt them on things that they may not have, you know, thought to bring up, and then dive in and tell you some fun story behind the scenes. And that's really what
Hmm.
we wanted to do. We wanted to give people a glimpse behind the scenes.
Well, that definitely comes through. And so, yeah, I'm so glad that you've been doing that and that you're still going to keep that up even as the pandemic, well, hopefully,
Yeah.
starts to go
Yeah,
away.
I kind of feel like, you know, with the reaction we've gotten, and the you know, the people that are reaching out. I mean, I'm getting personal emails from people I you know, that I worked with years ago
Mm,
that are like, oh my gosh, you know, I just got one. I mentioned it actually on air this week because it was somebody I hadn't talked to in probably 10 years, who lives
amazing.
down in Central Florida, and she wrote, she goes, hey, you know, this is so and so, and I, you know, I used to be with this, and you know, my husband and I are really enjoying this podcast, you know. So it was,
That's so
it's
cool.
really kind of wonderful to hear from folks, and we're just having a lot of fun. I mean, we're just being, you know, totally open and just asking great questions, I think, and
You
or at
are, yeah.
least trying to ask great questions.
You are.
But we're getting great stories from our guests, you know.
Hmm.
And by the way, the next 3 weeks we have Don Hahn with us.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so next week Don's talking about Beauty and the Beast. A whole conversation is just going to be on Beauty and the Beast
Wow.
because it's the 30th anniversary this year.
Oh
Then
man, you're right.
yeah, and then the following year we're doing the following week we're doing Hunchback because it's the 25th anniversary of Hunchback of Notre Dame,
Oh yeah.
and Notre Dame. And then the third week, we are talking to him about Atlantis, the Lost Empire, which is the 20th anniversary. So, I mean, it's just, you
That's
know,
great.
it's a lot of fun. You know, Don's been a good friend for many years, and so it was really just, it's a very easy conversation, a lot of fun, you know, a lot of laughs, and just, you know, letting people, you know, my whole role is to just prompt somebody with a question and let them talk for as long as they want to,
Yeah.
you know. And then if they say something, that's going to prompt another question, you know. And that's really what we're trying to do with the guests, and just give the audience insight into how these films get made and some of the crazy things that go on and some of the funny things and all
Hmm.
of that, you know.
Well, speaking of how movies get made, I want to wrap up here. I don't want to take too much of your time,
You
but
can take as much as you need.
oh, well, thank you. Appreciate it. You mentioned you worked on The Nightmare Before Christmas,
Yeah.
and I remember you when you came. Well, I remember seeing you. Actually, I saw you and Don Hahn and Mindy Johnson at Pacific Northwest Mouse Meet a few years ago,
Uh-huh.
and that was a great time. And you mentioned that you were writing a book on The Nightmare Before Christmas. Is there any update on that project? Is there a release date
I
on there?
I have finished. I finished that book a couple years ago. I turned
Oh,
it in.
okay.
Yeah, and last summer during the pandemic, I actually reviewed the layout for the book and wrote a whole bunch of captions for photographs, and you know, made some additional notes and things like that. And you know, because of the pandemic, well, let me step back for a second. So the book originally, I think they were going to try and put it out in 2019, and
Okay.
it got pushed to 2020 because of just scheduling with Tim Burton. He
Mm,
was coming off of Dumbo, and his designer was working on some Dumbo books that they made a priority.
mm,
So the Nightmare book was then pushed to June of 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and they furloughed a lot of people from Walt Disney Publishing last year. So, but last August, Tim's designer was finishing up the design on the book, so I was able to review that and write captions for many of the pictures in the book. And then I was told that it might come out in 21, which it didn't. So my guess is that they may be holding it back now for the 30th anniversary of the movie in 23.
Wow. So then that
So
book will have been done for like 5 years or something
5
like
years.
that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know.
Well, I mean, at least it's done on your part, and you can, work on some other projects.
I had a great time working on that book. That was another one that was a really a lot of fun, because I went up to the Bay Area and I spent the day with Henry Selick, the director. And I had known Henry for a number of years, but to be able to spend almost a full day with the guy and just talk about Nightmare. How did this start? When did you first get involved? Who approached you? How did all of those stories? And then I was fortunate that I was in London a couple years ago, so I got to talk with Rick Heinrichs, who is an incredible production designer on live action, has worked with Tim on a lot of Tim's movies, but he was also I think they referred to him as a visual consultant, but he was really like the production designer on Nightmare. I interviewed him. I got to spend literally, they had booked an hour and a half for me to talk with Danny Elfman about the music, and we wound up talking for like 3.5 hours at his studio. And he couldn't have been the nicer guy. I mean, there's so much great material. I really hope the book comes out in the next couple of years, because it's just it's a great behind the scenes of how that movie got made, seen through the eyes of all the artists, and I was one of the artists that worked on it. I had a very, very small part, but when publishing first asked me to write this book, I said, you do know I did work on the film. I have a screen credit on the film. They were like, no, we didn't know that. And I said, yeah, so it was like old home week to be able to go and track down all the animators and talk with people. And I did a lot of Zoom interviews and all of that, but it really is a comprehensive look at how that movie got made and the process, behind the scenes of all the things that had to be done and how the puppets work and all of that kind of stuff. It's just, I think it's going to be a great addition to anybody's library, especially somebody who's a huge fan of Nightmare Before Christmas. So fingers crossed it comes out at some point.
Well, I have to tell you, it was actually, the reason I asked was because, you mentioned it at the Northwest Mouse Meet, but also it was in my Amazon wish list, and when June hit and it wasn't out, I was like, where's the book?
I know that the page is still on Amazon, but I don't know what to say. Well,
I mean, I'll keep an eye on it.
Maybe all your listeners who want the book should write to Disney, Walt Disney Publishing.
Yeah, everyone should bombard them.
Everybody bombard them with letters and tell them that they want The Nightmare Before Christmas by Dave Bossert. So.
Absolutely. I love it. Well, and also that book had, or that, not that book, but the movie had such an impact on, pop culture in general. Yeah. I mean, it really, when it came out, it's grown so much in popularity over the years. And I know at one point during your research, you were asking people to send in, weren't you asking people to send in pictures of their Nightmare tattoos?
Yeah, we've got a whole mess of tattoos from people, and some of them are just unbelievable. They're amazing. I mean, people that had like
so detailed
a sleeve on their arm of all these Nightmare characters all woven together. I mean, it was really incredible. Somebody else, I think, had like one whole leg done.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's really
amazing.
Incredible. But the film has resonated with people, and when it first released, it did okay, but the studio really didn't know how to market the movie.
Well, it wasn't even a Disney movie, really. It was
They
Touchstone at the time.
well, yeah, they released it under Touchstone because they felt it was too scary to put it out under the Disney name, and they didn't want to tarnish the Disney name. But guess what? Now it's under the Disney name. It's
Right.
Disney Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas, because the Touchstone label's gone away. And you know, it's a film that seems to resonate with people. And it has grown an audience year over year, and they keep putting out more merchandise, and they do the overlay of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, and you know, there's just a huge following for this film. It's really an amazing picture, I think.
It is, yeah, the art and the music, and yeah, all of it really blended together in just such a beautiful way. So I'm looking forward to that book, and I'll hopefully, yeah, like you say, hopefully in the next couple of years we'll see it.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you talking to me. I hope that everyone picks up your book on Claude Coats. It's the street date's November 16th, correct?
Right, but if people want to get a signed copy of the book, it's signed by Alan Coates and myself. They can go to theoldmillpress.com, and they can pre-order that, and it's likely they'll have it a month before the actual official release date. So if they want to do that, if they just want to order it from their favorite online book retailer, they can do that. Or if they have a favorite independent bookstore nearby, their independent bookstores can order it through the normal book distributor channels. And they can get the ISBN number and the full title at theoldmillpress.com.
Sure.
So
awesome.
Okay.
Well, I look forward to seeing people pick up the book and read it. I know I really enjoyed it, so I'm sure that other Disney fans and beautiful.
So I'm going to try and hold this back here. But,
I'm glad you did.
But this is, I just literally received 2 copies of the book from our printer overseas this morning.
That's good
2
timing.
copies. I've just sent one off this afternoon to Alan.
Sure.
And that's my copy. Those are the only 2 copies in the United States at this time.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you did that, because I didn't have a book to hold up. I only had the PDF, so I really wouldn't have done it justice.
Yeah. So there you go. I'm gonna try and see if I can pull back here. But this is and boy, it's a heavy book. It weighs like 3.25 pounds. You know.
Yeah, it looks like a thick one.
Yeah, there's a nice drawing by Sam McKim on the back.
Oh, that's great.
That he did for Claude's 50th anniversary with the company.
That's awesome. Cool.
Yeah,
well,
I'm looking forward to getting it out into people's hands. I want people to see this book because I'm so proud of it, and it honors really somebody who deserves to have the spotlight because of all the things he accomplished for the company.
Absolutely. And that was one of the other things that I was so glad that you mentioned he got his Disney Legend Award, I think in 91, and then he passed away in 92. So I'm so glad that he was still around to have gotten that award at the time, and he was able to, know that he was appreciated. And I'm glad that his son's here to see this book, come to fruition, and for his dad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, by all accounts, Alan is thrilled.
Good.
So,
great. Well, Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I really appreciate you having me on to talk about not only the Claude Coats, but the Nightmare Before Christmas book and the Skull Rock podcast and all of that stuff. So,
well, you have so many great projects. I couldn't narrow it down to just your Claude Coats book. I mean, just even in your cartoon work with, helping to find and restore Oswald cartoons and the Alice comedies, I think, and so people can support you in that on Patreon.
Yeah, right? If people want to, they can go to Patreon. Actually, if you go to Patreon for a couple bucks a month, you'll be able to see some content that's not available anywhere else. There's some animation up there. There's a documentary I did that's 30 minutes long that's up. There's written articles and things like that. So you can absolutely find that. And also, if people want to, they can go to davidbossert.com. Davidbossert.com. There's links to everything through that website, to the Skull Rock podcast, to the Patreon page. There's also a tab on davidbossert.com that has articles and essays. There's an articles tab and an essay tab that has a lot of free content that they're happy, if they're interested, they can read about animation, animated films, all of that kind of stuff. There's some articles on Nightmare Before Christmas. There's even a tab for free stuff. So if they want to get a book plate, a signed book plate for one of my books, they can do it through that. So
awesome. People love free stuff, and I hope they
know.
It's great.
I love I love sending free stuff out. I really do. If people order the Claude Coats book or the 3D Disneyland book through the oldmillpress.com, they get a bunch of little things that they wouldn't if they went through other retailers. Awesome. There's coasters and bookmarks and information and stuff that's included in the book.
Awesome. Well, I hope people check out your website and of course pre-order your book, because that's available to do now. So yeah, well, thank you so much for talking to me again, and I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, I'll be seeing you around. I'm sure I'll keep an eye on all your upcoming projects. Best of luck with all that stuff.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good day.